You're listening to episode 5 of the Sovereign Sessions. So hey, and welcome to this episode of the Sovereign Sessions podcast. If you're new to this podcast, my name is Kathleen Sylvia and I'm the founder of the House of Unfurling, which is a website with coaching, wisdom and resources for women walking the priestess path. Today I want to talk to you about shadow work. So it's actually a really interesting period of time right now. So I've actually been journeying through shadows myself in the past couple of days. It's now May 2nd, and I feel like as a collective we'll be dancing with shadow for another 2 weeks. It feels like another 2 weeks, maybe a bit more. So it's going to be really interesting because on the one hand, we're now fully in spring and there's such a joyous, beautiful energy. And at the same time, as we are kind of exploring all of this beauty, fertility, pleasure, abundance, and we're really visually seeing all of these energies manifested into physical form through nature, through spring. We're also internally in our own journeys, we're going to be taken down into the cave quite a lot over the next 2 weeks. So it's like, it's going to be like exquisite pleasure and beauty on the one hand, and like this sense of life being like so delicious, and the potency of fertility and abundance. So there's that absolutely beautiful, magical kind of energy that we're experiencing, and then on the other hand, we're really going quite deep, and we're going into the darkness of our own shadow behaviors and programming and patterns. So I wanted to actually dive into this today and give you 3 tools or insights that you can use to journey through these next 2 weeks with a heightened awareness, I would say, of how shadow work shows up in your life, and insights into your own process. Because, you know, you may have heard me say this so many times already, but like we're billions of people, and all of us are different and unique and beautiful individuals. And so the way that things show up on our journeys, it does differ from one person to another as well. So I wanted to give you some pointers, so you can, and I will base them on my own experience and examples, and then you can take that and go and really look within your own life and journey and see how your own shadow work and invitations into shadow work, how that shows up for you in your own process. Because again, like everything really starts with awareness, and in a way that is the medicine and the gift of shadow work, is that it constantly brings us into more and more clarity and awareness about who we are and who we have been showing up as, so the masks that we wear, and then also all of the things that we do not want to see about ourselves. That is why we call them shadows. As people, we have a tendency to think of ourselves as walking in the light. And then we don't really want to acknowledge that there is also, with the light, always the shadow. And so many of us really, in a way, have a lot of resistance coming up when life itself invites us into shadow work. So that is what we're going to be exploring today. So first of all, when we look at shadow work, I also often call this shadow dancing, because to me that is more what it feels like. And to me, the very first point that I want to make is that shadow work or shadow dancing is a natural process of life. And I feel like throughout our lives, we are constantly being invited into more clarity about who we are, how we show up in the world, and if that is something that we wish to move forward with in the same way. That is what lies at the core of shadow work for me, is really this awareness of how it has been, and really seeing all the ways that it has been, the ways that have been hidden from ourselves, not necessarily from other people. I think this is very interesting as well. Whenever we meet our own shadows, it's very often very confrontational. But then when you talk about it with other people, they will kind of say like, yeah, but I've tried to point that out to you before. And we were really receptive to it. It couldn't land for us in our awareness. So it is like this natural process. And for me, it feels like life itself and our journey through life is inviting us into shadow work. So what exactly does it feel like when you're invited into shadow work? So first of all, shadow can reveal itself in different layers of intensity. So sometimes you start journaling as part of your daily morning or evening practice, and suddenly you become aware of something, like you have this insight or aha or light bulb moment, and you become aware of something, and it shifts something within you. So that is like, to me, you've been willing to look at what was going on for you. You've been doing the work with the journaling, and then there has been a shift. And that to me is more or less the same thing as shadow dancing, except that this happens in a very easeful and light-hearted, effortless kind of way. And then it goes all the way in intensity to days where it feels like you're stuck in a pit of tar or mud, and everything is dark around you. You don't know where you're going. You don't know what is happening. You feel like so confused and overwhelmed and lost, and things feel very intense in your body. And that is usually, when we hear people talk about shadow work, that is usually what they refer to, is that there's more very intense experiences. So, but we have these experiences throughout our lives, and I feel like the difference is that for many of us, when we're in our unawakened stages of our journey through life, we just don't really have the tools and the awareness to recognize what is happening. We just think that we have run into a couple of absolutely horrible days, and we don't really land fully into the medicine of the shadow. So we don't fully unlock the full awareness that would enable us to leave these patterns and lessons behind. When we go into shadow work through the stages of our journey where we are awakened, which to me means that we have stepped into like a very clear awareness of our life's journey and of this guiding force that underlies that life's journey. And so we have this awareness that we're being guided through our experiences, and that none of them are really happening to us, but they are happening for us, because life is ultimately all about growth. We understand that there are no coincidences. We understand that what happens is always an invitation into more growth. Whether it is something that is like exquisitely beautiful and exciting, or whether it is something that feels intense and dark and awful. So when you can step into shadow work with this awareness that is really a part of your life's journey, and that you're being invited into this to step into heightened awareness, to step into more clarity about who you are and how you've been showing up, and that this is really an opportunity to excavate medicine and to walk away in a sense of self that is much more, I would say, free, an experience of life that is much more free, then you can be present through the shadow dancing in a completely different way. So I'm not going to go into that in too much detail here, but if you're interested really in the process of shadow work, the invitation, and how to move through that into the medicine, I actually have on my website, if you go to the menu, it's called courses, and then just scroll that page, there is actually a mini course, and it's called Embodied Impact. And it's actually not a mini course because it's like 3 hours, I think, of video and audio. But I call it a mini course because, yeah, I've made it like super affordable, because I really want this work to be available to as many women as possible, because it talks about our natural impacts, it talks about the link to our purpose, and it talks about, it gives you a walkthrough through a process of shadow work and what that practice can look like. So you can find that on my website. It's like, I think €27 that it's priced at right now. So it's like really low barrier investment for you to step into. But what I want to really explain today about shadow work and shadow dancing and how life guides us into that is, the way that I would like for you to take this forward into your own journey is to really sit with this awareness that it is not random. And so when you have like these days when everything feels like so intense and confusing, and you can feel like something is happening but you just don't know why, and you're going through so many like moments of like low intensity, like sadness, anger, grief, overwhelm, all of those things, and you can really feel like this confusion, right? Then I would invite you to take your jhana and kind of sit with the question, like, this is something that is happening. I'm not aware of what it is right now, but I know that this is happening guided by my higher mind, or you could call this your soul self, your higher self. But there is a bigger picture. So when you can bring yourself back to that awareness that there is a bigger picture that you're moving through, it helps lessen the intensity of the experience. You'll still feel it, but it helps lessen the intensity, and because you suddenly understand that even though right now you're feeling confused, you're not going to stay here, because because ultimately there is something that you're moving through, and so you're going to come out the other side with clarity. So even though it feels confusing now, you're not going to stay in that space, and that makes us available just to move with the process with less resistance. So the way that, another thing actually that I would like you to play with in those moments is this visual image of what this journey could look like for you. And this may be something that you play with in your own mind, your own journaling time, when you're not in a process of shadow work or shadow dancing, more like in a regular, normal, I would say, routine for you. Then it's really fun to play with this. Like, when I go into shadow work, what does that look like? What image comes to me around that? What does my process look like? What does my invitation look like? And so sharing my experience with you is, to me, it's like I feel myself being invited into darkness, and it feels like this, I would say, a dark cave, but not a very fun one. It's not a fun dark cave. It's got like creatures and weird stuff, and it's really not a pleasant experience. But there is, to me, the initiation or the invitation really feels like being invited into an experience of descent. So going down into the darkness, into the cave, and it feels, it's an experience like I can feel that within my body, right? It usually takes me a day or day and a half to understand that I'm in a process of shadow working or shadow dancing. And by then I'm fully locked into that confusion feeling and all of the ickiness and the intensity. But then I realized, like, oh right, I actually felt that happening. I felt myself being moved into a descent. I could feel it in my emotional body, in my physical body, in my energetic body. I could feel myself being taken into the cave. So when you're in the cave, and again, you know, the images that come up for you around this might be totally different. So for me, it's a cave, and it's dark. I can't see anything. There's like moisture and mold on the walls. It's got these tar-like substances that I'm wading through. So the thing is, at one point, there's like a piercing energy that comes in, and it's like an illumination that comes in. And that is where I usually have these visuals of excavating the gems. So like within the cave, there's gems that are embedded, and I'm going down in a cave, and through the experiences that I have in the cave, I'll be excavating eventually a gem, one or more gems, and those are like the medicine and the gifts from this experience of descent into the cave. And the funny thing is, once you have that experience of illumination and you can kind of feel yourself like stepping into the medicine and the gifts of the experience, the cave for me in this example becomes just a normal cave. And it's like this quite pleasant, like cave-like structure you would have in some forests, in mountain areas. And it's like sunlit lights and beautiful rocks. And it's completely different. It's so incredible, really. And that to me is just like, okay, we're done. So I really would invite you to sit with that first kind of insight, like this is not at random. There is a higher mind that is guiding your experience, and to just step into heightened awareness of, you know, when I feel myself being invited into shadow dancing or shadow work, what does it feel like? And is there some like imagery that to me is associated with that experience? So those are two journaling reflection prompts that I'm going to give you for this first kind of insight. Okay. So again, it's kind of all related with one another. And I think at the end, it's going to give you more insights, more tools to really recognize when you're going into shadow working. So the second insight or tool that I want to talk about with you is patterns. So our shadow work can, like I said, can have like different intensities. And I would like you to, again, take some time and to really explore for yourself within your own life and your own journey what patterns show up for you, depending on the kind of intensity of shadow work that you're doing. So as an example, when I'm in a really intense type of shadow work, like intense, that is when I find myself resisting, but also running away. So what I mean by that is I will suddenly start binge reading. So I know for some people, they go and do some binge watching of television or Netflix or YouTube. For me, it's binge reading. And what that does is it's a very specific type of books that I read. And I'll read, I don't know, maybe 10 in one day. And I'm like a really fast reader. So, but what happens is as I read and read and read beyond my actual limit. And it's like my brain starts to go into overload. So I'm not even present to what I'm reading. I'm skipping details. I can't remember names of the characters in the books. I wouldn't be able to tell you. It all kinds of starts to become one story in my mind. And physically, I am exhausted. So and what I've seen from that, when I look at that, I can recognize that this is a pattern that I have when I go into a phase in my life where there's too much confusion. there's too much overwhelm, there's too much intensity. And for me, that's typically something that happens a couple of times a year when I'm really doing some intense shadow work. Basically, that is how I know also what I'm moving through, because otherwise I just don't do that. That is not my typical kind of behavior. When I'm reading, I do it only when my nervous system, my body, my emotional body is just going into like too much intensity with what I'm working through. So one of the things about shadow work is that it brings us face to face into confrontation with our own shadow, which is something that we don't want to see. And so I'm going to give some examples later on of types of things that can come up in shadow work. But typically it's something that we're very resistant to. We just don't want to see it. We don't want the lesson. We don't want the insight. We don't want to move through all of this emotional muck. We just don't want it. It's too much. We can't be with it. And when that happens, that is typically when we go into some quite intense kind of patterns. So my most intense pattern is definitely like binge reading. So I'm really asking you to kind of sit with this. If you go through a very intense kind of experience, which is not necessarily linked to any experience in your actual day-to-day life at that moment, right? So it's really like you're moving through something in your emotional, physical, energetic, mental body. You're not moving through something happening in your actual day-to-day life. And so what is your pattern that you go into when it's too intense? So that is my first question for you. So some of the things that come up for me when I'm going through something that is shadow work related. So it is dancing with my shadows, but it's not like really intense. I'll find myself suddenly wanting to do a lot of baking. And it's going to be the type of baking where I have my hands in the dough. So I'm kneading bread, I'm kneading pizza dough. I'm like just really needing to get my hands in there. That is incredibly soothing for my physical and emotional body. And when I'm doing that day after day after day, again, to me, that is a pattern, a typical behavioral pattern that I'm going to, because something is happening within me that is like, I need an outlet for that. It's too much, it's too intense, it's confusing, I can't quite see my way out, and then I need something like, physically working with just baking and dough. So again, another question for you is like, what are the types of behavioral patterns that you step into when you're working through something and you can't quite see the light at the end of the tunnel, and it's just a little bit too much for you, not too intense, but still you need this kind of outlet. So when we talk about this, I want to bring in how this relates to our nervous system. Because when we look at our nervous system, when things become too much, it typically has a couple of responses. And so one of them might be to fight. Like you're giving a lot of push back to whatever is happening, okay? You don't want it, you don't want to be faced with it. It's too much on your being, it's too much on your nervous system, your emotional body, your energetic body, your physical body is going into kind of this sensation of too much. And so you're pushing back against the experience. And so that is one of the reasons I think that for many of us, we're not trained in how to deal with intense emotions. We're not trained in how to deal with shadow dancing. So for many of us, one of our first initial instinctive responses when the invitation comes in and things start to feel uncomfortable, we start to go into intense resistance. Like we push back. We don't want the experience. We're pushing back and we're pushing back. And that actually is quite exhausting. Okay, so, and it's not, we can't keep doing it. You can keep doing it for a bit and then you're going to have to shift into another type of response. So that is fight. The second type of response is flight. And that to me feels like what I described with, well, actually, no, I didn't describe this one. So when you go into flight, you're going to start to want to distract yourself. And in my experience, what that could look like is I know something is asking for my attention. So there is shadow dancing that is happening. I'm being invited into the dance. And I'm not going straight away into massive resistance, but I do find myself kind of telling myself, like, I'm going to be sitting down and journaling about something later, but right now I'm first going to do the laundry and empty the dishwasher, and maybe, this would be a good time to make a lasagna from scratch, or I have to sow some seeds, or maybe I can reorganize and rearrange some of the furniture in a room. And it's like I'm looking for distractions, like all over the place. And yeah, so it's this sense of being busy, but in a way that prohibits you from actually sitting down and doing the shadow dancing. So that would be the flight response. And then we have the freeze response. Freeze is what I described with my habit or my pattern of going into binge reading. And it's because we don't know how to handle what is happening. And so what we're doing is we're freezing our actual presence in life and numbing it out so that we don't have the capacity anymore to feel the intensity of what is happening and what is calling for our attention. So it's like we're trying to overload our system in a different way, like really numbing it in a different way so that we're not available anymore for that intensity. Now, what could that look like in different patterns or behavioral patterns? You might actually, what I describe like binge watching, binge reading, you might actually go the other way, and instead of like not being active, you're actually going into hyperactivity. Like suddenly you can't stop working out. You feel like you need to go to the gym like 2-3 extra hours right now. That is another way that sometimes we look to just, I would say that's more like flight. So try and distract ourselves and try to run away from what is happening within our bodies and our inner experience. Other people do it with alcohol, and that is more of a numbing response. Again, it's too intense and we can't really handle how it feels, and so therefore we are seeking to numb our body, so that it becomes less available to feeling the intensity of what things feel like. So there are so many different responses that we can have to this. You might find that when you're being called inward into some shadow dancing, that you start to become outwardly like very aggressive and looking to start fights, and you're taking out the intensity on other people. Or you might actually start to fall back into patterns of emotional eating. So there are so many ways that we go into resistance, or we go into numbing, or we go into running away around shadow dancing. So this is my second invitation to you. This second tool for you is to sit down and to kind of explore what types of patterns that you have witnessed yourself go back to, either every once in a while, like maybe 2 times a year, or more regularly. And then to see like, okay, what happens actually when I do this? For instance, what kind of outlet am I seeking? What kind of inner experience am I running away from when I do this? And so again, this is going to help you step into heightened awareness around your own process of shadow working in your own life's journey. And then the third tool that I want to share with you today is linked to senses. So specifically the clair senses. If you're new to this, then again, I'm not going to go into detail around the clair senses in this episode of this podcast. But if you're interested in learning just a bit more about that, I have actually another short course on my website. It's called Deepen into Your Intuition. And again, you're going to find that under the menu tab, courses. But that is one of the topics. We discuss the different clair senses. And there's a guided meditation as well to help you discover your dominant clair sense. Okay. But so having awareness of your clair senses is really useful when we talk about shadow work, because very often our process of shadow work is going to be guided again through our clair senses. So let me give you an example from my own kind of journey and process. So I would say my 3 dominant clair senses are clairvoyance, clairsentience, and claircognizance. And so the way that shows up for me in my shadow work is, first of all, I will feel myself go into this descent. Like I explained before, it's like a physical and like emotional, energetic experience of feeling myself being drawn into, pulled into, invited into an experience of descent. So, and that typically like happens through feeling, right? And then there's the second aspect for me to the way that I experience my shadow work is through images. So I think this is probably why very often when I'm going through a really intense couple of days of shadow working, it can feel so overwhelming and confusing and intense, is because it speaks to me, the experience speaks to me in images. And I will be going through my day-to-day life, and at the same time I'm going to be receiving like flashes of like a still movie, and the way that they show to me are very often like more black and white, rather black and white than color, I would say. And it's like I can see it so clearly. It's like black and white, but very sharp contrast, like almost 3D. A moment from either my actual life experience or a moment that I haven't actually lived, but that is representing a metaphor for something that I'm needing to come to terms with, right? An aspect of shadow that I'm needing to come to terms with. And so that to me feels really intense. It adds to the intensity of the experience, because not only I'm going through an experience where it feels like foggy, confusing, overwhelming. I don't really know what is going on until, at some point in the process, I realize, like, okay, no, it's shadow dancing, and we're going to, land on the other side of this. But what happens is, with the images especially, they are very confrontational, because they show me how I will use the word failed, how I failed to show up in the way that I thought I was showing up. So the thing with shadow, like I said before, is that, it shows us things that we don't want to see about ourselves. And it's like when you're then seeing it in images, or whichever way it comes to you, it is very confrontational. Okay, so that explains part of the intensity of the experience. So let's see. And then another thing that happens for me is like knowing. I will have this sense of knowing, like, this experience, or this image, or this memory, or this, like, metaphor kind of thing is linked to this shadow dance that you're going through at the moment. So when I look at that, I'll see like little dots on a map, and at first they seem unrelated. And like I said, I don't know what is going on, so it feels like random, unrelated. But then the more that I go through this, the more images that come to me, I will suddenly start to realize that there is something linking all of them. And usually when that happens, that is very shortly after I will have my moment of illumination, because I will have like this aha moment, or this big insight that suddenly lands. And that is the way that I prefer to explain this. It's something that suddenly opens up, an insight that opens up, and suddenly I know what all of this was about, and what it is showing me. And it shows me then just, it helps me land into heightened awareness around some of my own patterns of behavior, and where I haven't been in congruency with how I thought I was showing up, or who I thought I was showing up as. So it's the shadow dancing brings us into heightened awareness, and then from that space we then have choice. It kind of like delivers us or opens us up into choice, new choice, because now you have this awareness about this pattern of yours, and you can really like take some time to think about, okay, how do I want to see this play out in the future? If I end up in a similar situation again, would I do things differently now that I know this? Would I change things? Would I change how I show up, or how I respond, or maybe not? But you have the awareness now that you can use and play and work with. Okay. So number 3 in terms of tools is to reflect on ways in which your senses are being used in your process of shadow working, because that is really going to help you recognize much earlier in your process, when you're going through another episode, another shadow working episode. Okay. So talking about shadow working, like, what is that really all about? So for me, it's about bringing us into an experience of heightened awareness about ourselves and giving you an opportunity for new or different choice. That is ultimately what it is about. Now, shadow and light coexist. So when you're going through this process, it feels confrontational because there's parts of you that you don't really want to see or acknowledge as being parts of you. But then as you go through the process, what happens is you're not destroying the shadow. You're not suddenly annihilating the shadow. You are simply witnessing the shadow. That is what you're being asked to do. You're witnessing the shadow. Okay, you weren't aware of it before. Now you're really being shown, in whichever way that is for you, but you're being shown that shadow. You're being asked to witness yourself in that shadow and to see that shadow as having been a part of you. And then what happens is usually you're going to start to shift into an experience where you can make peace with the way that you show up as a human being and you're not perfect. And that means that you're making peace with having aspects that you love about yourself and having aspects that you hate about yourself. And I'm using strong words at the moment intentionally, because usually what happens is you're going to see that merge into more of a softer and gentle and compassionate self-acceptance. So it's not really about loving or hating, but I'm using these words on purpose because in our society, and I think just as human beings in general, we prefer to see ourselves again, in light. We prefer to see the things about ourselves that are pretty and lovable and kind. And we don't want to see the ways in which we are manipulative and selfish and egotistical and just straight away like horrible in some ways. So again, you will land into an experience where it feels more merged and softer, and more integrated. But what's so interesting about using words like love and hate is that you can actually use your reaction to other people as a way to reveal more of your shadow without actually going into a self-guided kind of type of shadow work. By which I mean, there are people in this world that you have a lot of resistance to, and that you push back against. Again, that experience of pushing them away, pushing back against them, right? So people that you have a lot of judgment about, people that you don't agree with their behaviors with, people that you just have this instinctive kind of like really harsh resistance and rejection, and it feels intense in your body, like you have a very strong response to them. These are people very often who will embody or show to you an aspect of your own shadow. And when I first heard people talk about this, I was like, yeah, maybe. But then as I did more and more of my own shadow work, I started to see this more clearly, and especially with some of the more recent things that I've worked through, I can actually see them in some of my like close-knit circle kind of people. And so that has been like so illuminating, because everything that I was pushing against within another person is actually something that was quite a huge part of my own shadow. So that is another awareness actually to just play with and sit with and explore for yourself. But knowing that it's really about things that you don't want to acknowledge within yourself is really helpful when you're going into shadow working or shadow dancing. Now, typical things that I've seen in shadow work, both within myself, my own experiences, and, you know, when this comes up for clients that I'm working with, some of the things that come up can be things like, you may think of yourself as a very kind person. However, so that would be when I say we love to think about ourselves as like light, right? So you might actually think about yourself like, yeah, you know, you're a kind person. But then when you go through some of your shadow work, you actually realize that you're not kind. you're nice. But there's a difference between kind and nice. Kind is a choice that you make, an energetic choice that you make, and that you carry with you in interactions that you have with yourself and with other people. Okay, and with animals, like with anything. And it's like a very grounded energy, very rooted energy. It's rooted within your being and it's rooted within your core values. Nice is more of a surface level behavior, but underneath the nice behavior, you may actually have an energetic signature in that moment that is absolutely unkind. So this is one of the things that I have been working through quite recently, and that was quite shocking for me, because this distinction between nice and kind wasn't really something that I had ever experienced in a very energetic, clear way. And with what the shadow process showed me through images and feelings and knowings, is all of the instances where I thought of myself as having been a kind person. But in reality, I had been nice with an underlying seething energy of anger, resentment, jealousy, arrogance, privilege, and like generally like all of the icky stuff. So that was so interesting for me to see and to witness and I'm actually really happy that that is now fully landed into my conscious awareness, because now when I have interactions with people or with myself, I can look at them and kind of really reflect back within myself in that moment, like, am I just being superficially nice, which is basically just trained behavior? Or is this truly coming from the energy of kindness, which is one of my, like, I wouldn't say core value, but just a really important value for me within my own life. Other things that might reveal themselves to you as a shadow, okay? Where have you been manipulating people? Where have you been discounting people? Where have you been afraid to speak your truth? Where have you been saying one thing but actually meaning something completely different? Where have you been like a real kind of bitch towards other people and in relationships? And again, all of these questions, I think we all do this within our identities as human beings. We all have parts or elements of our being and our energy where we have these tendencies, and they are very often stimulated by what we see around us, either in the people around us or the media, the movies. So, when we look at love relationships, for instance, very often they are very codependent and very manipulative, the way that they are portrayed. So it heightens our own tendencies towards this type of behavior. And at the same time, we may also be people who think of ourselves as being very strong and independent and being kind and being open and being trustworthy and being wanting to do what is right and wanting to do right by the other person. And so we push away our own experience of ourselves in actual life situations as being manipulative or being obsessed or being seeking validation, seeking the buzz and the rush that we get from other people's responses to us. So we don't want to see it, but it's there. And so to us, it is a shadow. But to other people, it can be very visible. And so our own higher mind, our own higher self will be taking us on these journeys of shadow working, shadow dancing, whenever we're really ready to come to terms with some of the ways in which we have been showing up in ways that we don't want to, right? Ways that we reject within other people, ways that we resist within other people, ways that we judge in other people. Like when we talk about codependency, for instance, or obsessing, I used to really hate these types of movies and kind of manipulative behavior of the women towards the men, until I realized through shadow dancing, that I definitely had my fair share of that same manipulative behavior and obsessive behavior and codependent behavior. I just didn't want to think about myself in those terms because I thought I was a very strong, trustworthy person who had a very clean and clear energy. And so the fact that I suddenly, through this shadow dancing, realized that I had a lot of all of the icky stuff, underwoven underneath the surface. So the surface is what looks good, and underneath that is the energetic signature, which can be very, filled with all of these seething kind of icky kind of energies that we don't want to see. So shadow work, what it really does is help us become more and more clean and clear and pure in our energetic signature in our interactions with ourselves and with other people. So shadow working is basically, you could call it like almost like a purification process. But so again, that doesn't mean that we annihilate the shadow. We just come towards a much more integrated place. And from that integrated place, we have the awareness of the shadow being there. Whereas before we did the dancing with the shadow, we didn't have the medicine and the gift of it. We didn't know that this was part of who we were or how we were showing up in the world. Now we know, and so now we can move into our future interactions with ourselves and with others from this knowing. You know, you can ask yourself, like, right now in this moment, do I still have like this manipulative, grasping energy? Do I still have this unkind energy? Whilst on the surface thinking that I'm being kind, but it's really just being nice. So it really enables us to stand within ourselves in a much more conscious and purer way. So that is what I wanted to share with you today. The battery of my phone is dying, so I have to stop anyways. But I hope this was useful to you. And I hope that you'll be taking the questions that I offered to you in this recording, and that you'll be doing some exploration for yourself. Because to me, shadow work, it is one of the most like intense experiences that we go through on this journey, and it doesn't feel good. Okay, but at the same time, to me, it feels like so deeply rewarding, because after doing this work for like, let's see, 5 years now, that I've been aware of this dancing with the shadows and this process that I'm being invited to, and then move through and come out the other side with new awarenesses. I feel like it's really helped me step into sovereign embodiment. It's helped me step into myself from a place of much more self-acceptance, to look at my own humanity, which is both light and shadow for all of us, to look at it with more self-compassion, which means that whenever I show up as less than who I am intending to show up as, that I can, forgive myself. And, it does still happen. It does still happen that I leave some kind of interaction and maybe, I don't know, I got triggered in some way. And so suddenly I snap out of the awareness and the conscious presence, and some of my behavioral patterns are triggered, and in that moment I act again from a shadow. But now I can actually look back at the interaction and I can say, like, that wasn't really, I can see where I lost myself in that moment. I can see kind of the shadow behavior that was activated. I can see that I wasn't able to bring myself back in that moment. I wasn't consciously aware of what was happening in that moment because there was another trigger going on. And I could see that now, looking back. I can forgive myself for it, and I can train myself in being more attuned, even more attuned to my shadow patterns. And in doing that, I feel like I am becoming more and more present in all of my interactions, both with myself and with other people. So I hope that this was useful to you, and I'm going to leave it at this. And I'm so excited to speak to you again soon. Bye.